It was still dark when the noise started. Not shouting, not engines. A deep, grinding scream that didn't belong in a quiet neighborhood. Metal chewing through wood over and over again. For a split second, I thought something was wrong with the truck. Then I smelled fresh-cut pine and diesel, and my stomach dropped. I ran outside barefoot and stopped cold. A massive industrial woodchipper sat in my driveway, taller than my work truck, its wide mouth roaring like an animal. Men in reflective vests were feeding my firewood into it, one log at a time. Months of split oak and pine, the wood that kept our old house warm every winter, disappeared in seconds, shredded into flying chips before I could even speak. Standing a few steps away was the HOA board leader. Calm. Composed. Hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for a bus. When she saw me, she gave me a small, apologetic smile. "I know this looks upsetting," she said gently, raising her voice over the machine. "But this is an approved remediation. My hands are tied by the rules." I tried to talk. Tried to show her the permits, the fire marshal approval, the township clearance. She nodded sympathetically without looking at a single page and told the crew to keep going. Behind me, my twin daughter stood on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the only thing that heated our home vanish into the machine. Across the street, sprinklers clicked on automatically, misting a perfectly green lawn like nothing was wrong. Then the wood chipper shut off. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. She handed me a clipboard and said I'd be billed for disposal, then added softly, "You should be grateful we handled this safely." What she didn't know was that my grandfather didn't just leave me this house. He left me control of the one thing her perfect neighborhood depended on. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I moved my family to Cedar Ridge, Colorado, because I thought it would be quiet in the right way, not empty, not lonely, just steady. The kind of place where nights cooled off fast, mornings smelled like pine, and people didn't rush past each other like strangers. The house was the anchor. It had belonged to my grandfather, built long before the subdivision existed, back when the land mattered more than how it photographed. That history turned out to be a liability. Our place sat inside Pine Hollow Estates like a stubborn memory. Every other house looked like it came from the same blueprint, same angles, same paint palettes, same trimmed lawns cut to identical heights. Ours didn't blend. It was wider, older, and built for function instead of symmetry. The beams were thicker, the driveway longer, the yard imperfect but alive. To me, it felt honest. To the HOA, it felt wrong. The HOA board leader introduced herself during our first week. Marla Denton showed up mid-morning with a clipboard tucked neatly under her arm and a smile that felt practiced. She spoke softly, warmly, like she genuinely wanted us to settle in. She said she understood how stressful moving could be and assured me Pine Hollow Estates was a supportive community. While she talked, her eyes never stopped moving. She scanned my driveway, my work truck, the edge of the yard, the side of the garage, not obvious enough to be rude. Just enough to make me feel evaluated. When she mentioned community standards, her tone stayed gentle, almost apologetic. "I wish I had more flexibility," she said, "but the rules are very specific and my hands are tied." At the time, I believed her. The first notice came a couple of weeks later. It wasn't even called a violation. Just a courtesy reminder. It mentioned my truck being visible from the street and suggested I review the guidelines. No fine, no deadline. I shrugged it off and moved the truck, assuming that was the end of it. It wasn't. Another letter followed, then another. One about the firewood being visible. One about a patch of grass that wasn't uniform enough. One about a garden box placed slightly outside an approved area. Each issue on its own felt minor. Together, they created a constant pressure that never let the house feel settled. That was when I started noticing patterns. A neighbor across the street had tomato plants lining his driveway. No letter, no reminder. Down the block, a family had a swing set bigger than ours ever was. It stayed up for months without issue. Bird feeders disappeared from some yards and stayed untouched in others. The same rules, different outcomes. I told myself I was being sensitive, that HOAs were just annoying by nature, that maybe I was reading into things because the house mattered so much to me. Rachel noticed it faster. My wife works at the county library. She lives in records and patterns. One night, after the girls went to bed, she spread the letters across the kitchen table and started lining them up by date. Same rule numbers, same language, same timelines, different houses, different consequences. She started writing things down, addresses, violations, outcomes. When one house got fined and another got a warning for the same thing, she circled it. When nothing happened at all, she underlined it. The notebook filled quickly. Meanwhile, Marla's presence increased. Slow drive-bys, emails about upcoming inspections, friendly reminders that sounded more like warnings the longer they went on. Every interaction stayed polite, almost caring, but there was always a quiet implication underneath it. We were being watched. The girls felt it too. They asked why the lady in the nice SUV kept driving past our house, why neighbors didn't wave like they used to, why playdates suddenly got canceled without explanation. I told them it was adult stuff, boring stuff. It wasn't boring. It was isolating. As fall deepened, the pressure tightened. Nights grew colder. The air sharpened. Firewood stopped being a decoration and started being survival. This house had always been heated with wood. I made sure everything was perfect. Permits pulled, inspections completed, clearances measured twice. I didn't want to give Marla any excuse. That's when the tone of the letters changed. No more reminders. Now they were violations, deadlines, dollar amounts. Words like aesthetics and community image appeared more often, never clearly defined but always used as justification. When I asked for clarification, I got form responses. When I requested a hearing, the date arrived already decided. And beneath everything was a suggestion that never appeared in writing, but was always present. Maybe we didn't belong here. Rachel stopped calling it annoying. She started calling it intentional. She pointed out how enforcement followed questions, how pressure increased after pushback, how the sane families kept appearing on violation lists while others never did. By the time the first hard frost hit, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. And winter was coming fast. The firewood issue didn't blow up all at once. It crept in the way HOA problems usually do, slow, quiet, and wrapped in paperwork. It started with a warning letter. Polite language, careful wording. It said the firewood stack was potentially non-compliant and suggested I review the community guidelines. No fine. No deadline. Just enough to make me uneasy. I ignored it at first. The wood was stacked safely, neatly, and legally. It had been there for years, long before Pine Hollow Estates ever existed. When nothing happened for a couple of weeks, I assumed it was another empty flex. Then the fine arrived. The tone changed immediately. The letter referenced visual inconsistency and aesthetic impact, and included a deadline along with a dollar amount. It warned that continued non-compliance could result in corrective action. No explanation of what that meant. Just pressure. I requested a hearing. I honestly believed that if I showed up prepared, reasonable people would listen. I believed documentation mattered. So I prepared. I gathered permits from the township, fire marshal approvals, inspection reports, photographs showing spacing, safety clearances, and placement. I even printed records proving the house existed decades before the HOA. The hearing took place in a small room at the community center. Folding chairs, a long table, name cards. Marla sat at the center, smiling politely, hands folded like she was hosting a book club. I presented everything calmly, one document at a time. I explained how the firewood was essential for heating an older home, how it met every safety requirement, how I had followed the law exactly. Marla listened without interrupting. She nodded occasionally. She didn't argue or object. When I finished, she folded her hands a little tighter and said one word that changed everything: aesthetics. She explained that Pine Hollow Estates wasn't only concerned with safety or legality, it was about maintaining a consistent appearance, community image, property values. And while she personally understood my situation, the rules were very clear. "My hands are tied," she said softly. I reminded her the house predated the HOA, that the wood had always been there, that it was part of how the home functioned. She smiled, tilted her head slightly, and said, "Then maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit anymore." That was the moment it stopped being a misunderstanding. After the hearing, everything accelerated. HOA vehicles began passing the house slowly, sometimes twice a day. Notes appeared taped to the door warning of upcoming inspections. Emails arrived reminding me of deadlines that seemed to move closer every time I complied with something else. Inspectors showed up without notice. They measured things they had never measured before, took photographs from odd angles, asked questions that already had answers. I tried to adjust. I moved the wood back. I added screening. I covered it more neatly. Every change triggered another complaint. The fines increased. Rachel started opening the mail with a knot in her stomach. The sound of an envelope hitting the floor made both of us tense. The girls noticed us whispering at night, noticed how conversation stopped when they walked into the room. One evening, my youngest asked if we were going to lose the house. That question stayed with me. I called Marla directly and asked her what she wanted, not what the HOA wanted, what she wanted. She stayed calm, sympathetic, professional. She said compliance would solve everything. But compliance kept moving. When the firewood issue didn't disappear fast enough for her liking, the timeline shortened again. Letters became sterner, language hardened. Corrective action became approved remediation. I still didn't believe they would actually do it. No one brings heavy machinery onto a residential driveway without warning. No one disposes of someone's property like that without consequences. I was wrong. The morning it happened was bitter cold and still dark. I was asleep when the noise started, that deep, mechanical scream that didn't belong in a neighborhood at that hour. By the time I reached the driveway, the woodchipper was already running, and Marla was already there, standing calmly beside it, watching months of our winter heat disappear into metal teeth like it was nothing more than yard waste. That was when I understood the line had already been crossed, and nothing was going to stop unless I stopped it. After the woodchipper was hauled away and the driveway swept clean, something inside me changed. It wasn't anger. Anger burns out too fast. This felt colder, quieter, like a lens snapping into focus. I stopped replaying the scene in my head. I stopped drafting imaginary arguments. I stopped asking what I should have said or done differently. Instead, I started asking a different question. Why did she feel so comfortable doing that? That night, while the house was finally quiet again, Rachel went down into the basement. Not to escape, not to cool off. To work. She pulled open the old metal filing cabinet my grandfather had kept locked for years. The one I'd never touched because it felt more sentimental than practical. Old deeds. Survey maps. Faded folders labeled in handwriting I barely remembered. She laid everything out on the folding table like a puzzle that had been waiting decades to be solved. At first, it was just paper. Yellowed documents. Hand-drawn boundary lines. Legal language that felt dry and distant. Rachel sorted methodically, grouping by date, by parcel number, by reference codes. Hours passed without either of us speaking much. The girl slept upstairs, unaware that the ground under the neighborhood was shifting. Then Rachel stopped. She held up a thin folder and asked me if I knew what retained creek access meant. I didn't. The documents inside referenced a narrow stretch of land running behind Pine Hollow Estates. A creek most people barely noticed anymore because it had been dressed up with stones, paths, and signs about conservation. It looked decorative, communal, like part of the HOA's branding. Rachel traced the ownership history slowly. My grandfather sold land to developers years ago, piece by piece. But water rights were listed separately, always had been. He never transferred them, not once. He kept control of access, usage, and priority tied directly to the original homestead. I still didn't fully understand what that meant in real terms. So I called Henry Caldwell. Henry had been my grandfather's fishing buddy for decades and practiced law longer than I'd been alive. He was retired now and hard to reach, but when I told him what I was looking at, he asked me to read it out loud. I did. Carefully, exactly as written. Halfway through, he stopped me. He didn't sound confused. He sounded alert. "Send me copies," he said. I scanned the documents and emailed them. We waited. When Henry called back, his tone had changed completely. "You don't just live in that neighborhood," he said. "You supply it." I sat down. Henry broke it down without jargon, without ego. He explained that the HOA's water system, every sprinkler, every faucet, every manicured lawn, depended on access routed through that creek. And that access traced back to land my grandfather never gave up. Then he used an analogy that finally made it click. "It's like they built a toll road," he said, "but your grandfather still owns the pavement underneath. They can collect money. They can direct traffic, but they don't actually own what everything is built on. That alone would have been enough." Then Henry added the part that made my stomach drop. The HOA had been paying for that access. Quietly, monthly. Through a generic service arrangement they thought belonged to a holding company. It didn't. It belonged to my grandfather's estate, which meant they were using something they didn't fully understand, assuming it would never be questioned. I wasn't just another homeowner they could pressure into compliance. I was the one variable they couldn't control. Rachel saw it immediately. "They didn't target you because you broke rules," she said. "They targeted you because you don't fit into a system they barely understand." That reframed everything. The inspections, the speed of escalation, the decision to bring in a woodchipper at dawn. It wasn't confidence, it was fear. I wanted to confront Marla right then, to lay everything out and watch her scramble. Henry stopped me. "Leverage only works if you don't waste it," he said. "You don't swing it around. You hold it steady and let the other side reveal themselves." So we slowed down. Rachel went back to documenting, but now with purpose. HOA meeting minutes. Budget references to water services. Emails where the board talked about usage without ever mentioning ownership. Small details that added up to something much bigger. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. How often sprinklers ran, how obsessed Marla was with green lawns, how quickly enforcement intensified any time someone asked about utilities or shared expenses. The irony sat heavy with me. They destroyed my firewood to show they owned the neighborhood. They didn't realize they were standing on something they never truly controlled. That night, for the first time since the woodchipper arrived, I slept without my mind racing, not because the fight was over, but because I finally understood the board. They thought power came from clipboards, fines, and manufactured authority. They were wrong, and the moment they realized it was coming, there would be no way to stop what followed. I didn't shut off the water, not then. Not even when every instinct in my body told me I finally had the upper hand. That kind of power doesn't work if you swing it around. It works if you let people forget it exists. So instead of confronting Marla, I started knocking on doors. Not the loud houses, not the ones with perfectly edged lawns and fresh HOA-approved paint. I went to the quiet ones, the homes that looked lived in, the people who had learned to keep their heads down. I started with Tom Alvarez. Tom lived 3 houses down. His place always smelled like soil and motor oil, the smell of someone who actually used his hands. Before I ever met him, he planted a small vegetable garden along the side of his driveway. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, neat rows, nothing fancy. The HOA fined him anyway. When I knocked, he hesitated before opening the door. When he saw it was me, he didn't look surprised. He looked tired. We sat at his kitchen table while I told him about the woodchipper, about the paperwork Rachel and I had found. He listened without interrupting. Then he nodded slowly. "They told me the garden hurt property values," he said. "Same rule number they used on you." I asked him if he'd noticed other gardens still standing. He laughed once. Short and bitter. "Plenty," he said. "Just not mine." Next was Martha Klein. Martha was a widow in her late 70s who lived alone in the house she and her husband bought decades ago. She loved birds. Simple feeders hung from hooks in her yard, cleaned and refilled every morning. The HOA called them nuisances. She came home from a doctor's appointment one afternoon to find them gone. No warning, no explanation. Just empty hooks and a notice taped to the door. When I showed her the documents and explained what we were piecing together, her hand shook, not with excitement, but relief. "I thought it was my fault," she said quietly. "I thought I just didn't understand the rules anymore." That sentence kept coming up. House after house, different stories. Same structure, fines that escalated when questions were asked. Warnings that turned into penalties without explanation. People who paid just to make it stop. I didn't promise revenge. I didn't tell anyone I had leverage. I showed them proof. Dates. Rule numbers. Enforcement patterns. How certain addresses never appeared on violation lists, no matter what they did. How others showed up again and again. I wasn't asking anyone to fight. I was asking them to stop feeling alone. While I talked to neighbors, Rachel went deeper. She started requesting HOA records the way she'd learned to at the library. Calm, methodical. Budgets, vendor contracts, meeting minutes, nothing aggressive. Just curiosity wrapped in formality. At first, the numbers looked fine. Landscaping, maintenance, water services, consulting fees. Then Rachel paused. One vendor address looked familiar. She typed it into her laptop, pulled up a map, and zoomed in. The pin dropped on a quiet residential street. She zoomed again. It was Marla's nephew's house. Rachel didn't say anything at first. She just turned the screen toward me and tapped it once. That was the moment everything shifted from suspicion to certainty. From there, the pattern snapped into focus. Inflated invoices, services billed monthly that no one remembered seeing. Money looping through accounts connected by last names no one had questioned because authority had trained them not to. "This isn't sloppy," Rachel said. "It's deliberate." We didn't confront Marla. We formed a group. Quietly, carefully. No emails, no social media posts. No meetings announced in advance. Just conversations. Trust built slowly over kitchen tables, in garages, in my workshop with the radio playing low to drown out voices. Everyone brought their own paper trail. Letters, notices, receipts, emails. We compared language, deadlines, threats, same tone, same tactics, different victims. Rachel organized everything into clean timelines anyone could follow. No emotion. No commentary. Just facts stacked so tightly they couldn't be dismissed. Meanwhile, I kept my routine unchanged. I didn't avoid Marla. I didn't provoke her. I let her believe the woodchipper had done exactly what it was meant to do. She grew bolder. Fines increased. Deadlines shortened. Warnings turned sharper. She thought fear had worked. That was the mistake. Because fear isolates people until they realize they've been isolated on purpose. By the time winter settled in for real, we weren't just frustrated residents anymore. We were documentation, a record, a pattern that could be followed by anyone willing to look. And through it all, the water kept flowing. Sprinklers ran. Lawns stayed green. Faucets turned on without a second thought. Marla never questioned it. She didn't know the very thing she obsessed over most was the same thing, tying every violation, every fine, and every abuse of authority back to her. So we waited. Not because we were afraid, but because timing matters when the truth is heavy enough to bring something powerful crashing down. Marla escalated the moment she sensed the balance shifting. It didn't start with confrontation. It started with concern. Long emails sent late at night, carefully worded and copied to half the neighborhood. She wrote about unity, about stability, about how rumors could damage property values if people weren't careful. She never named me directly at first, but the message was clear enough that neighbors didn't have to guess. Then my name started appearing. She accused me of creating confusion and misrepresenting shared resources. She suggested I was frightening residents by implying control over utilities. One message warned people to report any intimidation immediately. Another cautioned that unauthorized claims about infrastructure could lead to legal consequences. It was a soft smear campaign, wrapped in polite language and community concern, weaponized calm. A few neighbors showed me the letters quietly, embarrassed, as if they'd done something wrong just by receiving them. I told them the same thing every time: don't respond, don't argue, don't forward anything. Just keep copies. That's when I formally asserted my rights. Not with a shutdown, not with a threat, not even with a public announcement. I submitted a request for review through the county, a narrow technical filing that asked one simple question: whether the current water access arrangement complied with recorded ownership and priority use. That was it. No accusations. No demands. Just a request for verification. It landed harder than anything I could have said. County inspectors arrived within days. Not HOA inspectors with clipboards and smiles, but state and county staff who didn't know Marla and didn't care about community politics. They walked the creek with measuring tools and notebooks. They photographed access points. They asked for permits and agreements the HOA struggled to produce. Then the audits began. Financial records were requested. Usage logs, payment histories, infrastructure diagrams. Suddenly, the generic water services line item that had floated through budgets for years wasn't enough. Officials wanted details, origins, authority. The numbers answered faster than people could. Usage logs showed heavy summer draw, especially from a handful of properties. Lawns that stayed green during droughts. Sprinklers that ran long after sunset. One address appeared again and again at the top of the list: Marla's. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Residents like Tom and Martha were fined over appearance, while the most aggressive water use in the neighborhood went untouched. The rules bent only one way. Creek monitoring sealed it. Flow rates matched the old records perfectly. The same access point my grandfather documented decades earlier. The same priority use. The same control path. Marla stopped emailing after that. She switched tactics. She called for a board meeting and framed it as reassurance. A chance to clear the air. The agenda listed routine items, but word spread quickly. By the time the meeting night arrived, the room was packed. People who had never attended before arrived early and stayed late. Folding chairs filled. Residents stood along the walls. Some brought folders. Others brought nothing but crossed arms and long memories. Marla opened the meeting with her familiar calm smile. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke about maintaining trust. She tried to move quickly through the agenda, steering away from finances and utilities. Hands went up anyway. Questions came politely at first. About enforcement consistency, about budget transparency, about why certain vendors couldn't be verified. Marla answered carefully, deflecting when she could, promising follow-ups when she couldn't. Then the county representative stood. They didn't accuse anyone directly. They didn't raise their voices. They stated facts. Missing permits, undisclosed relationships, financial irregularities, a pending freeze on certain accounts while a formal investigation proceeded. The room went quiet. You could hear the HVAC kick on. Someone dropped a pen. Papers rustled as neighbors leaned forward reading along. Marla tried to regain control. She questioned the scope, challenged interpretations, claimed misunderstandings. Then a neighbor asked her if she had any personal connection to a specific vendor. She hesitated. Just long enough. That pause did more damage than any report. Another neighbor asked why enforcement intensified whenever questions were raised. Another asked why fines increased during months when those vendors were paid the most. Another asked why residents were warned about me instead of being shown records. Marla's voice tightened. She attempted to adjourn early, citing hostility. The board didn't back her. For the first time, the votes didn't move automatically. A resident made a motion to allow the county review to proceed without HOA interference. Another seconded it immediately. The vote passed without debate. Marla gathered her papers with shaking hands and ended the meeting abruptly. Outside, something unusual happened. People didn't scatter. They stayed. They talked openly in the parking lot. They compared letters, shared stories, laughed quietly at the realization that fear had kept them isolated longer than necessary. No one looked at me like a threat. They looked at the empty chair Marla had left behind. Later that night, I walked down to the creek. The water moved steadily through the channel my grandfather had protected long before anyone thought to brand it. Wild on one side, perfect lawns glowing under floodlights on the other. The contrast said everything. Marla had always believed power came from noise, speed, and control. She never understood that silence, paired with records, is what actually brings things down. Once the records were released, the story stopped belonging to any one person. It moved on its own. Rachel uploaded the documents the same way she'd organized them. Clean, chronological, impossible to misread. Budgets, invoices, meeting minutes, vendor names matched to addresses. Payment dates lined up with enforcement spikes. No commentary. No accusations. Just facts stacked neatly and labeled. Within hours, neighbors were reading. Within a day, the tone of the neighborhood shifted completely. People who had stayed quiet for years started asking questions openly. Not angry questions, careful ones. The kind that come from people realizing they were never confused, just deliberately kept in the dark. Marla tried to get ahead of it. She sent one last email, longer than any before. It warned against misinterpretation of financial data and accused unnamed individuals of pushing a personal agenda. She claimed transparency had always been a priority and promised to address concerns at the next board meeting. It didn't land. Too many people had already seen the same patterns in their own lives, the same rule numbers, the same letters, the same deadlines that appeared the moment someone asked a question. The county's involvement accelerated after that, not dramatically, methodically. Requests for additional records, notices of asset review, formal letters that didn't threaten but didn't negotiate either. The language changed from cooperative to procedural. That was when Marla's confidence cracked. At the next meeting, she looked smaller. Still polished, still composed. But the ease was gone. She spoke faster, skipped explanations, tried to stick to the agenda like it was a shield. The room was full again, even more than before. When the county representative spoke, it wasn't a speech, it was a summary. Funds routed through unlicensed vendors, undisclosed relationships, enforcement actions that coincided with financial gain. Assets associated with those transactions were being frozen, pending further investigation. Criminal fraud referrals were being prepared. He finished, closed his folder, and sat down. That was it. No accusations hurled across the room. No dramatic confrontation, just gravity. A neighbor stood and made a motion for a vote of no confidence. Another seconded it immediately. Marla tried to speak. She raised her hand, smiled tightly, and said she welcomed transparency. She reminded everyone of how much she'd done for the community, how hard the job was, how easy it was to misunderstand complex systems. No one interrupted her. No one defended her either. The vote was called. Hands went up across the room, not angrily, not hesitantly, calm, decisive, one after another. The result wasn't close. Marla stared at the count for a moment like she didn't recognize the numbers. Then she nodded once, gathered her papers, and stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sharpest sound in the room. She left before the meeting officially ended. No one followed her. In the weeks that came after, consequences arrived in measured steps: removal from the board, formal notices, orders to repay funds, restrictions on future involvement in HOA leadership. Investigations widened as shell companies dissolved under scrutiny. The vendors vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. The fines that had haunted people for years were suddenly under review. Marla never sent another email, never made a statement, never showed up to explain herself. It was like the authority she'd worn so carefully evaporated the moment people stopped believing in it. I drove past her house one evening not long after. The lawn was still green, but the sprinklers weren't running. The driveway was empty, curtains drawn. The contrast hit me harder than satisfaction ever could. This was the same person who had stood in my driveway at dawn, Anne's folded, voice gentle, while my firewood disappeared into a machine. The same person who told me compliance would solve everything. The same authority that handed me a bill and expected silence in return. Now she was gone, undone by the same system she'd weaponized. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a quiet understanding settling over the neighborhood. People talked more openly now, not about her, about each other, about what they'd put up with, about what they wouldn't accept again. When I walked past the spot where the woodchipper had stood, the pavement was clean, no marks, no evidence it had ever happened, but the memory stayed. Not as anger, as clarity. Because the moment that mattered most wasn't when Marla lost her power. It was when the neighborhood realized it never belonged to her in the first place. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, like the kind of quiet that follows a long storm. For a few weeks after Marla's removal, Pine Hollow Estates felt suspended. No violation letters, no mass emails, no sudden inspections. People waited, half expecting the old patterns to snap back into place. They didn't. Instead, the HOA reset itself in public. An interim board was formed from residents who had never wanted the job. People known more for asking questions than giving orders. Meetings were announced properly, agendas shared in advance, minutes posted afterward without edits or omissions. The rules didn't disappear, they were examined, line by line. Anything that relied on vague language was rewritten. Aesthetics became measurable standards. Community image became irrelevant. Enforcement procedures were standardized with written warnings, fixed timelines, and appeals that actually worked. Most importantly, The same process applied to every address. Selective enforcement ended because it no longer had anywhere to hide. The water agreement came next. Henry helped make sure it stayed clean and boring, exactly the way it should have been from the beginning. The HOA formally acknowledged the original water rights tied to my grandfather's homestead. Access was granted through a transparent contract reviewed by the county and made available to all residents. Usage limits were defined. Rates were fair. Payments were tracked openly. No leverage. No threats, just clarity. As part of the settlement, my family was compensated for the woodchipper incident, not just the cost of the firewood, but the forced disposal, the cleanup, and the fines that never should have existed. The check arrived in a plain envelope, heavier than it looked when it hit the table. Other families received the same quiet closure. Tom Alvarez was refunded every fine tied to his garden. He replanted in the spring without asking permission. Martha Klein got a written apology and a reimbursement, and her bird feeders went back up the same afternoon the letter arrived. Other residents received notices acknowledging uneven enforcement and detailing corrections. There was no announcement about it. No speech, no press release. People just noticed. Neighbors started lingering outside again. Conversations lasted longer. Kids rode bikes without parents watching the street for familiar SUVs. The fear that had kept everyone contained began to thin, replaced by something steadier. Winter came properly that year. The first heavy snow hit early, muffling the neighborhood in white. I stacked firewood again, slowly and deliberately, right where it had always been. I measured clearances twice, not out of fear but habit. No one touched it. No letters arrived. No warnings followed. The wood stayed put, and the house stayed warm. One evening, the fire crackled in the living room while my daughters sat on the floor doing homework, their feet tucked close to the heat. Rachel leaned against the doorway, watching them with a look I hadn't seen in months. Relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Relief. The neighborhood looked different now. Less polished, more real. Lawns weren't perfect anymore, and no one rushed to fix them. Gardens came back. Decorations appeared that didn't match anyone else's. Small signs of individuality returned, quietly but confidently. I still walk down to the creek sometimes, not to monitor flow or check levels, just to listen. On one side, the water moved wild and unbothered. On the other, perfectly green lawns glowed under floodlights. The contrast didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt balanced. Because what changed wasn't just a board or a set of rules. It was the understanding that fairness doesn't need to shout to work, and that communities don't function on fear, but on people willing to stand still long enough for the truth to settle. I still think about that morning sometimes. Not just the noise of the woodchipper or the cold pavement under my feet, but the look on my daughters' faces as they tried to understand how something so wrong could happen so calmly. How adults could stand in a driveway at dawn, destroy someone's property, and call it procedure. Marla believed power came from being untouchable, from speaking softly while doing damage, from wrapping intimidation in concern and letting paperwork do the bullying. She counted on people being tired, busy, and isolated. She counted on silence. What she didn't count on was memory, or patience, or the way ordinary families start comparing notes when pressure doesn't let up. She didn't count on the fact that systems built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. My grandfather used to tell me that ownership isn't about land, it's about responsibility, about knowing what you hold and choosing not to use it recklessly. I didn't win because I had leverage. I won because I waited long enough to use it the right way. We didn't fix this neighborhood by becoming louder or crueler. We fixed it by forcing fairness back into a system that had forgotten who it was supposed to serve, by documenting everything, by standing together, by refusing to believe that authority automatically means truth. If you're dealing with an HOA that's trying to push you into silence, Remember this: keep records, ask questions, and don't assume the loudest or calmest voice in the room owns the most power. Sometimes the real strength is quiet, patient, and already written into the ground beneath your feet. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?